need to true up with them appropriately on let's talk about exactly what we mean without disappearing down sort of the Poindexter hole of now I'm talking in so much detail and they're going, okay, this guy can't see the forest for the trees.
Right. No, it's absolutely and I think that's one of the things that's really challenging about connecting an area of specialization and the value that it creates with generalist populations, right? Specifically in the rest of the C-suite, right? And so, you have to kind of decide what language you're going to speak. So let's get started here, because I think that this is actually already turning into a really cool conversation. For those of you who are just joining us, this is Accelerating Value. My name is Mark Stouse. This is I think a really unique podcast in that we talk to all kinds of people, all kinds of functions, all levels of seniority and experience in for-profit, not-for-profit, government, other kinds of organizations, about one thing, and that is how do they think about value creation? How do they invest in it, protect it? How do they communicate it? How do they prove it? So Russ Somers is somebody I've known for a while now and is a good friend, and he is the CMO of TrustRadius. So we have obviously just been talking as sort of like a little prelude to this podcast, and we have already talked about 12-string guitars and octaves and all this kind of stuff, and then we kind of merged that into a conversation about lingo, right? And how you have a set of vocabulary that is used within specialist groups of all kinds to communicate ideas quickly and succinctly. This is jargon, right? But that jargon is only rarely used to exclude people, although I guess it is used that way. But most of the time, it's a fast and easy way of communicating in a very precise and mutually understood kind of way. So one of the things that this goes straight to is the creation of value and how we communicate it, how we talk about it. And I think that Russ, you have been in a role now for a number of years with TrustRadius, where this is exactly, in a sense, what TrustRadius is all about, right? It gives people a platform to evaluate B2B software and to do it both technically and experientially. Am I right?
You're 100% right, and that's one of the cool things about it is we have, our reviews tend to be very detailed, where our process is designed to elicit a lot of useful detail. So as you go through, typically a good reviewer will actually elicit, this is how I'm defining the value that I'm getting from this piece of software. And that makes it super interesting and super useful in two ways. Number one, as a buyer, a software buyer, I can go, this person gets me. This person gets my use case. They're using it the same way I do. They think about value the way I do. It makes great sense. And the flip side is for the vendor, you can actually do a much better job of marketing yourself because you've got that value that you talk about all the time, which is hard for marketers to convey in customer language. Innately, it's in the customer's language, and that makes it very, very powerful because customers trust it.
Right, absolutely. So when we talk about this, and I really want to kind of pull on some threads here, and certainly this relates to TrustRadius and things like that, right? But it's kind of far more profound than any one product, and that is the role of confidence and trust in value creation. How do you see this kind of playing out? Obviously, this is happening in the context of TrustRadius, but when you read what people are writing and then how that value is being created both for the vendor and for potential customers, how do you see that in terms of the confidence and trust piece?
I mean, the core thing is, you know what happens in business without trust, right, Mark?
Right? It all grinds to a
Nothing.
screeching halt.
No one buys
Right.
anything, right?
Right.
And where people, we've always looked for information to justify our decisions or to inform our decisions, but where we get that information has changed a lot based on demographics. And an interesting statistic, and one that many people don't believe on first hearing it, is last year, 60% of major software purchases were driven by millennials. And we tend to think of millennials as people eating avocado toast and dodging their student loans or whatever, but that's not true. Millennials are, if you look at the age on the cohort, they're now in their 40s. They have mortgages, they have kids, they are full-fledged adults, and most importantly, they are driving the software purchasing process, and they buy very differently than Gen X or boomers. They look to social proof first, not last. A classic, sort of Gen
Yeah.
X boomer thing is you're going to evaluate the software based on what the site says and what the analysts say. And last step, before you implement, you're going to call a friend who's used it. And millennials flip that on its head. Before they ever consume marketing that's been put out, the first thing they look for is, what do their peers think? What do other people who have used it? And certainly we know that word of mouth is super powerful. And if you can ask a friend who's implemented that piece of software, of course, you'll always do that. But a lot of times you can't. And that's okay, because we are now very socialized to, if we're going to buy a pizza, if we're going to rent a hotel room, we look at the reviews. We go, what do other people think about this? And that's precisely now what software buyers do, which is actually a critical problem for software vendors, because you can no longer assume that the journey is going to start on your site or start with your trade show conversation. The journey starts in a place where, if you're not paying attention, you may not have visibility to, and that is obviously search, but then looking at review sites, comparisons, etc.
Right. One of the things that that this really plays into is, particularly in the tech space, right, where you have a lot of startups, and it's sort of a which comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of situation, right? Because one of the biggest headwinds for a startup is that they don't have customers, or they have very few customers, right? And so there's not a basis for the kind of this play it forward, trust and confidence creation activity, right? And so they can get stalled out based on this whole issue.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that you're probably seeing evidence of that in your own platform. I mean, not for your business, but I'm talking about people who are being reviewed there, or not.
No, I think
It could be.
you've got a great point. They have to start somewhere, and it's hard because you've only got a handful of customers. It's not like you're going to have a lot of reviews. So, there's a couple things, and bear in mind, me, and as a marketer, what I specialize in often is being early and building that early stage go-to-market, so getting past things like this. So there's sort of two answers. The trust radius answer is, you may have a hard time driving a lot of reviews, but you can still sort of claim a profile, put your content there, and when you've got your one or two good customers, literally call them and say, please write me a review, just to start the engine, right? And then the other piece of it, which, I've learned as a practitioner, often being, an early marketer in a company, is get those first few customers and hold them close, right? Just make sure that you're really engaged, that you know what they're thinking, because you get one customer and a great customer, and you can repeat that all day. You look for customers like them, but you have to hold them close, which again goes to, would you write me a review? Would you do this for me? Would you speak at a conference with me? Would you speak on a webinar, etc.?
This is sort of a random tangential question off of this, but have you guys gotten to the point, when you look at all the reviews, can you tell a difference between the ones that have that are the result of a deal between the vendor and the customer, and the ones that are purely organic?
That's a really good question. Oh my gosh, because we obsess about content quality, objectivity, neutrality. We have an algorithm called TR score that's designed to weight reviews based on a number of criteria. And an obvious and non-controversial one is recency. Obviously, a review written last month is probably better than one written 3 years ago, only because software changes over time. So that's incorporated, but source is incorporated as well. Understanding, did it come from one of our campaigns? Did it come from the vendor's campaign? If so, was the vendor behaving in what we deem a trustworthy manner, right? Or is it strictly a, I'll scratch your back, you'll scratch my back? I know of one large enterprise software company that is offering a bounty of $1,000 for a 5-star review on Gartner Peer Insights. And that's fine. Maybe Gartner Peer Insights doesn't care about that. We do. And we will watch for that. And we may keep the review if it's an honest, trustworthy review from a real user, but we will change how much that affects the scoring based on if it's trusted. The other super interesting thing here is most vendors, and we on their behalf, incentivize reviews, because frankly, writing a review may take, 20, 30, 40 minutes. Most business people won't take time to do stuff
Right.
just for free for that.
Right.
But what we find is that when we incentivize, we get sort of an even distribution of scores. And when you don't, you get the really mad people and the really happy people and nothing in between. So actually, by properly managing incentives and properly assessing the motivation of who's reviewing, which our algorithm does, you end up with a good normal distribution of scores. It actually gives you information.
Yeah, I can see where that would be really important, because if we look at just on the consumer side, all the different review sites and all that kind of stuff, it's completely polarized. If you just had the most mind-blowing experience at restaurant A, and your wife or partner was just, completely enthused, and you might be motivated enough to leave a glowing review. But otherwise, it's going to take an absolute catastrophically awful experience to get you the same level of motivation. And so I could see where that would be. That's a really important nuance. It's kind of, we think about manipulation, right, and manipulating experience and value and all that kind of stuff. And the word manipulation has a negative connotation to it. But as a parent, I can tell you that there is such a thing as positive manipulation.
That's a great perspective because, sometimes I go, I manipulated you to unload the dishwasher, and my evil plan works brilliantly.
Right.
But, I honestly think of it in that regard. I think of it a couple different ways. I really think of it as compensating people for their time for a thing they didn't have to do. And as long as that's not tied, if you say, I'll give you a gift card for a 5-star review, you got problems. Right. If you say, I'll give you a gift card for an honest review, and you're using that just to compensate people for time, it makes more sense. We also have a program called TRUE, which stands for Transparent, Responsive, Unbiased, and Ethical. And this recognizes vendors like, thinking about who comes to mind, Avalara comes to mind. I believe SAP is True Certified. I know that Cisco is. And you can think of it as GMO free for reviews when you see that a vendor is True Certified, because a lot of people are trying to game the system. And when vendors are willing to make a commitment and show the proof that they're not gaming the system, then we believe those vendors ought to be elevated and perceived as even more trustworthy.
Well, I think that the other part to this too is that when you're doing the promotion, so you're creating value potentially for your customer, right? Mm-hmm. And for anyone else who wants to read up on whatever their customer's offering is, right? But you're also creating value for Trust Radius in a statistically valid sense, because the more reviews you get, the more statistically valid each one of them becomes. Right? So that's a really great example of creating responsible value, real value, right? Not only for all of your users individually and collectively, but for Trust Radius as well. Would you say that is one of your biggest investments as a CMO, is in that kind of campaign?
It's pretty big across the business for us as a company, because the value from that goes beyond marketing value. It goes to value to the overall marketplace that we serve. So not only do I care about it, but our chief product officer, our head of research, all of those people care about it as well. I will, if you don't mind, if I caveat one thing.
Sure.
I get, you and I both think mathematically. I grew up in the data mines. Those were my first roles. I know how you think. You're very data driven. The one thing to consider is not all data points are created equal.
Very
and
true.
that's sort of the important thing about TR score. So if it's strictly the more reviews you have, the more trustworthy the final score. Well, if your behavior in your review site encourages people to game the system, then you may add a lot of observations that cloud the value rather than unveil it. And that's why I'm, yes, number of reviews matter, as does, are they vetted? Are they trustworthy? Do we know the source? And that to me is the secret sauce, because what people are really looking for is, can I trust this information? That's
Absolutely.
all they want to know.
Right. Do you guys differentiate in your own minds? It could be on your platform as well, but between confidence and trust.
But confidence versus trust. Tell me a little more. This is an interesting question.
So confidence, if you look at a lot of the decision-making psychographic research that's been done over the last, say, 20 years or so, confidence is I believe you can do what you say you can do, right? And if you say your software can deliver all this value for me, right, then I either am confident in that, or I have something less than full confidence in your ability to do that. And that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you're a good person or a good organization, or I can trust you, right? So an example of this in real life that I use a lot is that I trust my wife, right? I trust her with my life, literally. But I have zero confidence in her ability to drive a Formula One race car at 200 miles an hour, particularly with me in it with her, right? So this would not be a good thing. But it says nothing about how much I trust her. So in a business kind of situation, there are some companies, that we're probably both aware of, where they are known to be past masters in their specific area, but very few people trust them. And so you if you're going to use their product, you go into the negotiations with your eyes wide open, right? And you understand what it is that you're going to have to bear against on the trust side of the equation. So that's what I mean by the difference between these two.
No, that's super provocative, and I like the way you're thinking about it, because what that means is fundamentally confidence is about capability and trust is about character. So does your wife have the capability to drive that Formula One race car or not? Open question. I don't know. I haven't evaluated her skill. But let's say that let's say that she hasn't. Okay, let's say she's not trained and experienced that way. Then confidence would be, I'm not going to get in the car with you because I don't have confidence in your ability. Trust would be, I believe that if she's not capable of driving this race car with me in it, she's going to say, Mark, driving race cars is not in my wheelhouse. I can go around the track at 30 miles an hour, but I'm not going to put the hammer down and risk both our lives. So trust, to me, the key thing is it always comes back to some element of character. And both, I think you will agree, both people and companies have character. There are companies that act with integrity, and there are companies that have developmental opportunities. And so the more, I will always choose to do business with someone that's proven to act in a trustworthy fashion if I possibly can. It's not just capabilities.
So actually, this is a great segue, because one of the things that we talk to guests about on accelerating value is not just business value, but there's the whole rest of our lives, right? So marriage is actually a really great stand-in for a lot of this kind of stuff, right? Because a lot of the things that you go through en route to deciding to marry somebody are remarkably like a B2B buyer's motion, right? I mean, like the bottom part of that whole decision-making process is essentially, it's no longer about, how much fun we have and all this kind of stuff. It's about due diligence and risk mitigation, right? Mm-hmm. So my wife would say, she hasn't said this to me that I can remember, but I'm pretty solid ground. She would say this, that when we were dating and everything and getting progressively more and more serious, that she was evaluating two things. Am I a good person? Am I trustworthy? Am I ultimately going to stay there with her, be a part of her life in a constructive way? All that, love her, all that kind of stuff, right? And can I hold a job? Can I make a decent amount of money? Can I provide for my family? Can I teach our kids good life skills? All this kind of stuff, right? And that both are really, really important. So when you kind of think about how you see the rest of your life and the way that you create value in your family, in your community, in your avocations, music is a great one, right? And we can kind of dissect some of these. How do you think about that? Like, do you kind of have metrics, sort of, or priorities? Not maybe metrics, but priorities. How do you organize value creation in your relationships with people?
That's a really good question and super interesting, as I now deal with two teenagers as well as my wife. Right. Teenagers are...
Me too.
Yeah, you know this, right? You and I live this every day.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is, and I'll go back to the dating analogy for a minute, as you're evaluating your wife and she's evaluating you and such. And my wife and I have been together something like 34 years, so evidently the trial period was successful and we converted. But
right.
A big piece of it at that phase, if you think about it, is information asymmetry, right? In terms of whether you're thinking about buying software or thinking about, choosing to commit your life to this person. There's stuff you know and stuff you don't know. Will this person leave their socks on the floor, right? Will this person, and there's things that you can know that are what they do now. There's also, here's the intriguing thing, there's what will they grow into. I know this person will be a great partner. Will they be a great co-parent? I don't know. Will they be a great grandparent? I don't know. So you look for the leading indicators there. And just to bring it back to B2B software as an analogy, a piece of that is roadmap. You want right. This is why when people buy software, they don't just buy capabilities. They want to know what the software product believes and where it's going, because that determines if you're going to have a good long run together or if it's going to be a couple years and then upgrade. And I have always preferred the long-term commitment. The other thing with the information asymmetry is if it's you and a potential spouse, there is the information they can choose to share or not. I leave my socks on the floor, and the information in terms of their roadmap. Teenagers are kind of bluntly discovering their roadmap. They a lot of times don't yet know what they like, what they value, what value is or value isn't. So in a lot of ways, a conversation with a teenager is nothing more than a really enlightening discovery call.
No, it's true. I mean, teenagers are sass, right? They're constantly going through modifications.
So this is intriguing because you said teenagers are sass, and I'm going to say no matter how you spell it, you're 100% correct.
That's excellent. Now, so when you're sitting there with your fellow musicians, how do you think about the value that you deliver to them?
To other musicians, what a good question. I mean, my foundational roles musically were always bass. I play guitar, I write, I do many things, but my first roles foundationally were I bought a bass, and 2 weeks later I started a band, because it's like, how hard can that be? And the nice thing about bass is you are inherently in a service role. You're inherently, I mean, there are flashy bassists. I love John Entwistle. I love Geddy Lee's playing, lots of flashy people. But at the end of the day, you've got to say, is this serving the song? Is it linking, and this is where you get really into music theory, but you're linking both the rhythms coming out of the drummer to the harmonic structure. And then you're also typically leading that harmonic structure. If you listen to a good bassist, you will hear the chords about to change because the bassist just did this. So I think of those things as basically, having grown up a bassist has taught me to think in terms of service, in terms of music. Not just does what I'm playing look good, but does what I'm playing serve the song? Does it serve the audience? Does it serve the other players? And all good players do that. They call that having ears like radar.
So one of the things, that marketers are really known for is valuing orchestration.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, in my career, one of the things that has struck me over and over and over again is how many marketers and communicators avocationally are musicians. I mean, Corey DeBrouwer, great example of that. He writes about it and he plays, right? Do you feel like that your work in a band has, from a value creation perspective, has made you, how has that impacted your ability to be a marketer?
I guess the core way it's impacted, it's a good question. And I think the core is it forces you to realize that you are not the whole. You are just a part of the whole.
Right.
And again, bass is, there's a few people you will go and watch play solo bass with no other backing, but typically you won't. So sometimes you find yourself saying, I have this great guitar lick, I have this great piece, and you know what? It steps on the vocal. So I'm going to take down my guitar playing, which was at a 10 in terms of I was doing something awesome. I'm going to take it down to a 6, not because I want to be a lousy guitar player, but because the vocal here needs to cut through. And so even though I love this part, I'm going to change it to something less interesting on purpose. And, when you mention orchestration, that's super important because you are, as a marketer, you're not playing the whole song. You are just a piece of it, and you have to go, what role does sales play? What role does product play? What role does CS play? And if you think about those things carefully, then you can orchestrate a really great experience for your customer. And if you don't, you run the risk of being a great marketer that is not moving the business forward and syncing with the others. Have you seen, there's a viral YouTube video, and I think the title is something like, This Drummer is at the Wrong Gig. And you have a wedding band playing a very simple traditional song, and this guy is just super showy all over the place. And that's what you risk being if you don't think about orchestration in terms of, yes, is what I'm doing good or not, but how does it fit with what everybody else is doing to the greater end, which is, let's create a customer, let's serve a customer, let's delight a customer.
So for those of you who may not know who Corey DeBrouwer is, he is the Google/Alphabet corporate affairs and chief communications officer, and he's kind of a titan in that line of work. One of the things that Corey talks about a lot too, since he stands astride the same two areas that you're involved in, right? Is that as a musician, he grew up, the kind of the classic statement is, I don't read my reviews, right? I don't care what anyone says about my performance. It's not why I do it, right? And yet one of the things that he really learned pretty early as a communicator and as a marketer and as a business leader is that if the only people who determine his value is everybody else, right? How do you think about that kind of in a broad front, right? Your own performance, the performance of your team, the performance of Trust Radius out there in the marketplace, and how do you square that with the fact that at the end of the day, you also have to still be you, or in the case of Trust Radius has to still be itself?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think no business and no musician is for everyone, right?
Right.
So, I don't read my own reviews. You actually kind of want to, because you want to know what people say, but you also want to be cognizant of the fact that the people writing reviews may actually not be your end user, your customer. So I would say you want to read that, but you also want to look at the floor and go, are people dancing, right? Are people responding to the music in whatever way? Exactly. And I think that's the way you have to think about it as a marketer. You're always going to get, sometimes you'll get kudos for that was a brilliant campaign when it was literally something you did over a weekend. And sometimes you'll put months into something and it will absolutely fall flat. You can't entirely judge your self-worth based on what others think, but you have to ask what was the objective and who was the audience. Because if people that are not my potential customer ignore my marketing, I'm cool with that. It doesn't much matter. If the people that I want to influence, whether it's people coming to the site to read reviews or people, vendors that can potentially use the content and tools and intent data and such to reach an audience, if it falls flat on them, that's a very different proposition. So to me, I've always got to ask, who's my audience and what does my audience think? And everything else is just a proxy for that.
Russ, it's been a great conversation. Thank you so much. For all you guys, we're on weekly. Pick the best way for you to consume podcasts, whatever that is, Apple or whatever, right? You can access accelerating value on that platform. Thanks so much. See you real soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.